Okay, so we got a bunch of updates from Apple today. We're going to kind of go straight to the camera since this is a photography channel. I do want to make a couple notes though. There is a new watch. There is also a major new update to the iPad and the iPad Mini in particular. So I want to talk about the Mini because I've done videos before where I've talked about my field workflow with actual cameras and how I get stuff into Lightroom. This actually looks kind of attractive for mobile work or maybe even use as a monitor. So the iPad Mini, major performance upgrades, 40% CPU, 80% GPU, connectivity of 5G. We've also got a better back camera. I think this is clearly designed for this whole stay-at-home scene that we're in with Zoom and whatnot. And we also have Apple Pencil compatibility. It comes in at $500 US or $499. I think this is actually interesting if you're looking for something to use as a monitor that's going to do a little bit more, or if you do a lot of work with Lightroom and you want something that's just a little bit bigger than a phone to work on. Maybe the regular iPad or the iPad Pro is too big. It's kind of a contender. So let's jump straight into iPhone 13 from a photography perspective, because I think Apple have thrown a lot at the camera system in here. There's some major improvements. There's some stuff I'm really excited about that I think are important to discuss. And so with the 13, remember we have different versions. So we have the iPhone 13, the 13 Mini, and we also have the iPhone 13 Pro and the iPhone 13 Pro Max. So first of all, we are going to talk about iPhone 13. So all these phones got new tech, bigger batteries. The displays have gotten a bump. This is actually important because if you do video work and you're using Dolby Vision, that is an HDR space that you're working in. So now they're saying non-HDR content, you're going to have a maximum 800 nit output on the screen, 1200 outdoor for HDR content. So what that means is a brighter display. You're able to see a wider gamut of colors and lights, and it looks really spectacular. So this is actually HDR output. The other thing I want to discuss that they were a little bit vague about in the keynote is they're saying you're going to get true blacks with a new contrast ratio. They didn't specify what that is exactly, but anyway, I think what you're going to see is a new improved OLED design, and the screens are going to look really awesome. Apple has now moved to the A15 chip, which is actually very important when we're talking about computational photography. And so what this means is it's got a 6-core CPU, 2 high-performance cores, 4 high-efficiency cores. This is going to give us what Apple are saying is 50% faster performance. There is a 4-core GPU, which has a 30% bump in speed. We also have a new 16-core neural engine. This has to do with computational imaging. So this was designed with the camera hardware and software teams. It has a new display engine, a new video encoder and decoder. So let's jump into those camera improvements. So this is not an iPhone 13 Mini, it's an iPhone 12 Mini. So I'm using it for illustrative purposes here. One of my gripes with this was the ultra-wide camera. It just wasn't that good. It seemed like it was not on par with the main camera that you had on here. Well, we do have a new ultra-wide camera. So it has a new faster sensor. The f-stop on the lens is an f2.4. It is a 13mm equivalent lens. It's a 5-element lens. So they've actually put a little more effort into the glass that's on here. 120-degree field of view, and it has improved noise in dark areas. I think this is actually very important because when I was shooting on this before, a lot of times when you're using a really wide angle, you have a wider range of exposure that you're dealing with, and noise likes to hide in shadows. So if you have a lot of shadows in your image, typically that's where you would notice the noise. So that is a huge improvement. Also of note is on iPhone 13 and iPhone 13 Mini, you are now going to get sensor shift image stabilization that previously was only available on the Pro and Pro Max iPhone 12 models. So basically what this means is if you're shooting video handheld or you're shooting stills in low light and things start to get a little bit shaky, you want some kind of stabilization. Well, there's 2 ways of achieving this. You could do it on the sensor level where the sensor actually moves along with the camera, or you could do it on the optical level where it's in the lens. Now what they said in the keynote is this now features sensor shift optical image stabilization. So I am assuming that is a combination of the two. So that's a huge addition, and it's going to make the iPhone 13 and the iPhone 13 Mini just a different experience to shoot on for both stills and video. We also have a new video feature called cinematic mode, which is actually pretty interesting. So the way this works is it emulates what we call rack focusing. So rack focus is a method that you see in cinema where you're, let's say, focused on my face and there's somebody else in the background, and the focus will change to draw draw your attention to something else in the frame. So this is an emulation of what that is. Now, it's difficult to do on a phone because we don't really have a shallow depth of field because the sensor's so small. So what this is going to do is actually going to use artificial intelligence to create this, and it's automated. So what it's going to do is it's going to detect in the scene, let's say the focus is on my face and I turn around to talk to somebody behind me, it will automatically know to change the focus to the person in back. You can also do this manually by tapping on subjects or faces or whatever it is. This will work at 1080p up to 30 frames per second, and it is using artificial intelligence. It's going to be blurring the image, but from the examples they showed in the keynote, it looks very promising and actually quite useful. Let's move on to the cameras in the Pro versions, iPhone 13 Pro and iPhone 13 Pro Max. This is iPhone 12 Pro Max. It's here for illustrative purposes. I'm very excited about this. We have an all-new camera system. All three cameras are new. The first one that I'm very excited about is the telephoto camera on here. So on iPhone 12 Pro and iPhone 12 Pro Max, this was a 50mm equivalent, which is a decent focal length. I would not really call that a telephoto. I would call that a normal length on most camera systems. It's decent for portraits, but now we have a 77mm focal length equivalent, which is actually, that's more into portrait range. So I am excited about that. We also have a new ultra wide angle lens, and this was the weak link on the 12 Pro and 12 Pro Max. And so this is an f1.8 aperture. It's a 6-element lens, so it's considerably better. And it features autofocus. And they're saying it's going to give you a 92% improvement in low light. 92% is pretty substantial, and I'm really excited to get my hands on and try this on this phone finally. We also have a new standard wide angle camera. This one will be an f1.5. It has a 1.9 micron sensor, which will give you a boost in low light, and they're saying up to 2.2 times improvement. So this is really exciting. Now, those are the only camera specs that they mentioned in the keynote, and even the website didn't give me any more information. So I don't know how many elements are in the 77mm lens or the standard wide angle. So we'll have to wait and see. I'm sure it will be good. That's kind of an Apple thing. We'll get to that in a second. We also have macro capabilities on the ultra wide angle lens, which is actually fairly interesting, which now the minimum focus distance on that ultra wide is 2.2 centimeters. So yes, it definitely has to have autofocus if it's going to cover that kind of range. I would rather see the macro on a slightly longer lens, but I guess it's better than nothing, and it improves what you're able to do with the phone. The other thing that's very significant is night mode now works on all three cameras, not just two of the three. So this is a big step up. Another feature I'm excited about is what Apple are calling photographic styles. So when they started to describe these, it sounded like putting filters on still images, which I would not be excited about. But photographic styles are much more complicated than that. They actually allow you to customize the imaging pipeline that happens when you take a picture with one of these cameras, which does multiple exposures, combines them together, uses HDR computational imaging, but it allows you to customize that process a little bit. So what you're going to do is you're going to start with one of the style presets, and it allows you to adjust things like the warmth of the image, the tone of the image, and you can actually save that as your style preset. And what it's going to do is it's going to, one, preserve skin tones, but you don't have to reset it for different kinds of things. So if you like your images more punchy, more saturated, you can be indoors shooting a portrait and then go outdoors, and it's going to adapt to the environment that it's in. It works with the computational imaging. So I think this is something that's actually really interesting. Also interested to see how this works alongside ProRes. So ProRes was a feature that we saw in a firmware update for the iPhone 12. And so what ProRes allows us to do is shoot in a DNG format. And ideally, eventually, you will have access to a lot of the parameters within the image. Now, right now, you can bring it into a RAW editor, and it just behaves like a RAW image. But it'll be interesting to see how all this starts combining together as this technology matures somewhat. And one more feature that's going to be coming in an update later this year is the ability, if you shoot video, to shoot in Apple ProRes. So Apple ProRes is typically something that we use as an editing format that we use for delivery and professional video solutions, and it kind of blows my mind that they're bringing this to the phone. If you shoot in Dolby Vision, I think there's an enormous advantage there. So one of the big trade-offs of this is those files are pretty big, so there are some limitations. So it's going to be limited to 4K footage up to 30p. In other words, you're not going to be able to do 60p in ProRes. And then here's the other weird one, is on the base model for this phone, which is the 128 gigabyte version, it's going to be limited to 1080 video up to 30p. So you're not going to be able to do as much with it, and I'm pretty sure that has to do with storage requirements. In fact, you're going to fill that phone up pretty quick if you're shooting a lot of video and you don't have enough space for that. So I can see why Apple did that. They tend to want to control the experience, and they want to make it the best experience possible. That goes for all of their products. So I'm not surprised that they're putting the brakes and some limitations on that. But the fact that you could shoot ProRes at all on this phone is just mind-blowing to me, which is going to lead me to another point here. So one of the reasons that I get really excited about iPhones in general is the possibilities of what you're able to do on these. I remember when I got my first iPhone, and the image quality that it did with still images was just not great. It didn't do video at all. My first phone was the 3G. Later on, video came and it was really shaky and it just didn't look all that great. But every time they put these features on a phone, I could see the possibilities. And when you start to see those possibilities improve, it's pretty astonishing what is possible on a phone, essentially. So a couple weeks ago, I did a little review on the iPhone Mini, and I wanted to shoot the whole video on the Mini. I'll link that up here if you haven't seen it. So it's very different for a review because I tried to be more cinematic. It's more vlog-like in spots, and I shot the whole thing just using the iPhone 12 Mini. And I was really blown away with how good the footage looks in the end and how usable it is, pretty much almost in a professional capacity. I mean, the exception would be the lenses, because I think you're dealing with such a small lens space here. So that's the one thing that I would notice the difference on. I don't know that most people would. Photographers, videographers, if you know what you're doing with the camera, that is one thing you're going to notice the difference on. The one thing that I noticed, and this is super nitpicky, the only situation where this had trouble performing was either in very high contrast light or very low light. High contrast light, it was doing HDR and it did pretty well, but you needed to go in and control your exposure manually. In low light, you did start to see some noise even with Dolby Vision. And so that was the only minor complaint that I had. But I think for most situations where you've either got controlled lighting or you've got enough lighting, they were really impressive in terms of video, and stills have always been great on these. And so I'm really excited to see this advance even further. And I think the new lens configuration on the iPhone 13, I'll definitely be upgrading. So I'll follow this up with a full review once it comes out and I've had a chance to use it. Would love to know what you guys think, though. I know there are other phones that outspec iPhones. That's always been the case. Other manufacturers tend to like to be on the forefront with lenses and periscope elements and all the bells and whistles and be forerunners in the phone space. And Apple really have never done that. They release things with more conventional technology, but what they do is they do it better than everybody else, or at least that's what they strive to do. And that's my impression with Apple products. It's not the only phone out there, obviously, but it's one of my favorites because of that. I think they tend to play it safe, but they deliver so well. Would love to know what you guys think, so drop me a comment. I'll see you guys in the next video. Until then, later.